All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start with my introductory remarks. Thank you all for joining, um, and welcome to the CRC Roundtable. These sessions are a monthly virtual seminar series where we host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advancements and management needs. These webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. So each seminar invites a diverse range of researchers, managers, and other professionals to have conversations around critical topics. The point of this is to build connectivity between all of us, provide a place to ask clumsy questions, and to increase our collective competency for decision making. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to provide their own introductory remarks, allowing for a full 30 minutes of discussion following. These webinars are recorded, and past webinars are available on the CRC website and YouTube channel. So I encourage you to review these, especially if you've missed some of the past discussions. Please do type your name in the chat, your organization, and location so that everyone can see our webinar's community for today's panel discussion. We also ask that you stay muted with your cameras off while the speakers are presenting. Um, and with that, I'd like to start by laying the groundwork for why this topic, why now, and why these speakers. So as summer winds down and schools across the watershed begin a new academic year, we thought this would be the perfect moment to shine a light on what's happening in the K through 12 environmental literacy space. At the same time, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement is being updated and reviewed for public comment. As someone relatively new to the region myself, I was struck by how deeply environmental literacy is woven into both the Watershed Agreement and many local curriculum requirements. That particular level of integration is something that many other regions don't have, and it reflects the unique connection communities here share with the Bay and its watershed. The progress achieved over the past decade under the existing agreement shows us what's possible, and the updated agreement offers an opportunity to build on that momentum. In many ways, the Chesapeake Bay can serve as a model preparing the next generation of environmentally conscious leaders. Because lasting environmental change depends on the people who live here, education initiatives, especially meaningful watershed experiences, are critical. They provide young people with both the knowledge and the motivation to make environmentally responsible decisions, ensuring the future of the Bay is in good hands. So, why these particular speakers? We are fortunate to be joined by two leaders in the field. First, we'll hear from Olivia Wisner, who is a watershed education specialist with Maryland's Department of Natural Resources and the co-chair of the Chesapeake Bay Program's Education Work Group. Olivia has led incredible efforts in both Maryland and across the watershed, and she'll start by walking us through the progress made under the current watershed agreement and what lies ahead for the environmental literacy and associated goals. We're also honored to have Dr. Mark Stern from Virginia Tech, an expert in the human and behavioral dimensions of environmental education. Dr. Stern will take a step back to share broader best practices for designing effective environmental literacy programs based in sound research. Together, both speakers, Olivia and Mark, bring complementary perspectives, one rooted in policy and practice across the watershed, and the other focused on the science of how people learn and act. So with that, speakers, I will gracefully let you know if you bump up against time by turning my camera on. You have about 12 minutes for your presentation. Attendees, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. If we don't get to your questions during the webinar, we will give speakers the opportunity to address them after the webinar and share that information along with any resources mentioned in today's chat back to the community through a follow-up email. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Olivia, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Gabriella. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Wisner. I am the Environmental Literacy Partnership Coordinator here at Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And I'm so happy to be here talking to you at this CRC webinar. I am actually a product of the CRC's environmental management staffer position. So it's an honor to be asked to speak. And I agree, this is very timely. I don't know about the rest of you, but back to school season feels like the start of the new year more than, um, New Year's Eve to me. So, as Gabriella said, I'll talk to you a little bit about environmental literacy at the region and sort of the goals and progress at the Chesapeake Bay program related to environmental literacy, and then hand it off to Mark to talk more about the science that supports this work and some of those best practices. So first, what the heck is environmental literacy? If you Google it, there are all kinds of definitions out there, but the most important thing is that students have the knowledge to understand environmental systems and how humans impact those systems, but they also have the skills and disposition to solve environmental problems in their area, in the watershed, across the world. And how they get there is through experiences, um, outdoor experiences, hands-on experiences where they're interacting with that issue and the related solutions and taking some kind of action to make a difference. And so I've pulled two definitions from some of our colleagues here in the watershed, one from Virginia Department of Education and one from my friends at the Maryland Association for Environmental and Outdoor Education. But importantly, environmental literacy is multidisciplinary. So it doesn't just happen in science class. It can't just happen in one lesson. And so, given that, one framework for successfully implementing environmental literacy is called the MIWE, which stands for the Meaningful Watershed Educational Experience. This is a nationally recognized framework. It's learner-centered. It focuses on those investigations and those kind of local actions. And it incorporates four sort of essential elements that describe what students do. So, getting invested in a local issue, making sure that they have time outside to experience their natural world, making conclusions, and then finally addressing that issue through some kind of action project. There's also four supporting practices that describe what teachers do to kind of support successful MIWI implementation, but I just wanted to define that term for you if it's new. And we're very lucky because in the Chesapeake Bay program exists. It's this awesome and unique regional partnership that kind of leads the protection restoration of the Chesapeake Bay. And its vision in the 2014 version of our watershed agreement is that we work together to make sure that the watershed is economically sustainable, that we have clean water and abundant life, conserved lands and vibrant cultural heritage. And all of that is kind of birthed by environmental education and personal experiences with nature. So we're very lucky to have environmental literacy included in that agreement. It was first included in 2014. And as Gabriella mentioned, we're undergoing the process of taking a look at that agreement and revising it with kind of necessary amendments to make sure that we can effectively implement our goals and streamline our structure and process. And the agreement itself is really cool because it kind of serves as a roadmap for all of the states, local governments, nonprofits that are working towards making sure that we have a healthy and clean Chesapeake Bay and watershed. So, over the last year, the education work group at the Chesapeake Bay program has been taking a look at our outcomes and making those necessary amendments to make sure that our goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And so over the last year, we've had listening sessions, Work group members and folks from the community have filled out surveys and submitted public feedback. We've had many work group meetings, which is an awesome opportunity for environmental education providers to sit down with formal educators and representatives from the state departments of education to talk about sort of our overarching goals for environmental literacy. We've sat down with individual states to better understand, given the conditions in your specific state, how could these goals help advance your progress? We've gotten some great feedback from the management board at the Chesapeake Bay program and finalized some measurable outcomes. And now the draft revised agreement is open for public comment before September 1st. And so I'm going to share with you sort of where our revised outcomes landed and give you a snapshot of our progress on each of those. So the revised watershed agreement includes two outcomes related to environmental literacy. One is the student experiences outcome, and one is the school district planning outcome. And I will talk about each of these individually, starting with student experiences. Um, so our goal across the watershed is to continually increase the number of students who participate in inquiry-based environmental literacy instruction. So if you remember from that definition of environmental literacy, this is something that's hands-on, that's multidisciplinary, that kind of takes time and gets students outside. And so the overarching outcome is that we want to increase the number of students in the watershed who get that kind of experience, with the goal of working towards at least one full-blown MWE, meaningful watershed educational experience, in each elementary, middle, and high school. So the goal is that by 2040, 75% of all public school students in the watershed will get one of those full-blown MWEs at least once during their K-12 learning career. So maybe it happens in elementary, maybe it happens in middle school or high school. And so that is sort of the updated outcome. How is this different from what is currently in the 2014 watershed agreement? First, we emphasized that inquiry-based instruction piece. So we updated the language to better convey that the inquiry-based instruction is the valuable part of our environmental education ecosystem, and that we still want to see those MWEs because they're such a nationally recognized model supported by research. We also emphasized at least one MWE. So, of course, striving for multiple is important, but in the spirit of making achievable and time-bound outcomes, we kind of set the goal at one MWE during a student's K-12 career. We renamed it. So previously, this outcome was called the student outcome, which got a little confusing because typically in formal education, that refers to like specific learning objectives. So to differentiate it from that, we've called it student experiences outcome. And we set a numeric target for the whole watershed. So previously, this outcome just said continually increase, over time, just make sure there's more. But we've worked together as a work group to make a specific measurable outcome, which is that 75% of all public school students in the watershed will have one of these experiences. And it's important to say that each participating state set a numeric target, which combined created our goal of 75% of students. So that's based on what's kind of realistic and attainable for each of the individual states. Um, One of the ways that we have measured our progress towards the environmental literacy goals in the watershed agreement is through something called the Environmental Literacy Indicator Tool survey. And the Chesapeake Bay program has administered that survey 5 times, about every 2 years since 2015. And 44% of all of the school districts, also called local education agencies in the watershed, have submitted some kind of response to that survey. So that's 44% of all school districts, but that represents 74% of all of the students in the watershed. So we have a pretty good understanding of sort of where we are in achieving this student experiences goal. What you're looking at right here is the availability of a system-wide MIWI in the elementary school grade band by state. So you may remember that we'd love to see MIWIs at every grade band, once in elementary, once in middle, and once in high school. And but this kind of gives us a sense of at least once. Is there going to be a system-wide MIWI in each of the states? So that data is available for elementary school, middle school, and high school. And that was just a quick kind of run through. But you may notice that in high school, there's less system-wide availability for those MIWIs, and it goes down into more of that some availability. Of course, that's in part because students have the opportunity to choose some of their courses. And so for the high school level, we're really interested in seeing MIWI availability in at least one required course. So the nice thing about this is that the trend in data from the 22 to 24 collection of the ELIT survey shows an increase in the availabilities of MIWIs in elementary, middle, and high schools throughout the region. And when you're looking at the school districts that in the survey in 22 and in 24, um, the amount of system-wide MIWI availability increased. So that's basically saying folks who reported last time saying that they were in this range of some availability tend to move up to system-wide availability of MIWIs after 2 years. So that's the good news. And there's lots of other data that supports the student experiences outcome that can be viewed on Chesapeake Progress. And I think Gabriella might have the link to that for you to check it out if you're so interested. There's also cool interactive maps if you're more interested in looking at your school district or your county. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. The next outcome in this draft revised version of the agreement is the school district planning outcome, which is to continually increase the number of school districts that have policies and practices in place that support environmental education and sustainable schools. So the student experiences one is measuring what percent of our student body across the watershed is getting one of these experiences. And now we're talking about school districts. Do the school districts or local education agencies in the watershed have the policies and practices in place to make sure that students are getting MIWIs and other inquiry-based environmental education, and that schools are lessening the impact of their school buildings and school grounds on their local watershed through sustainable school practices. And so the target for this outcome is that by 2040, all jurisdictions, which just means the states in the watershed and the District of Columbia, reach their target for the number of school districts that are well prepared to deliver a comprehensive and systemic approach to environmental literacy. So this is a new take on this outcome for us as a work group, because each of the states have made kind of internal goals about the number of their school districts that will be well prepared. And by 2040, we want to see all of the jurisdictions achieve that goal. And what the heck does it mean to be well prepared to deliver a comprehensive and systemic approach to environmental literacy? Um, as I said, this ELIT survey, Environmental Literacy Indicator Tool Survey, is self-reporting. It goes out to all of the kind of science supervisor folks in each of the school districts in the watershed, and they're asked questions like, is there an established program leader for environmental education in your district? Is environmental education infused into appropriate disciplinary areas in your curriculum? Do you have regular communication across the school district about environmental education? Do you offer high quality professional development for your teachers? Is there a documented plan for how you are going to implement environmental education across your county? These are the kinds of policies and practices that we're talking about. Based on a school district's response, all of the statistical magic happens on the back end, courtesy of our great contractor, and they're grouped into well prepared, somewhat prepared, and not prepared. And so by 2040, we want to see all of the school districts or all of the states reach their goals of the number of school districts that are well prepared. Um, how this outcome is different from the 2014 version is that we emphasize that this planning has to happen at the school district level. We understand the local control nature of education in a lot of the states within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and so it's up to them about how they want to do this and when. Um, we also renamed it to emphasize that importance of the school district's role in increasing the environmental literacy of our graduates. We added sustainable schools. So previously, sustainable schools was its own outcome, but we've kind of couched it in here with school district planning because we recognize that as schools and school districts pursue green school certification, that provides space for outdoor learning and MIWIs that support their environmental education goals. So they're kind of married together under this outcome. And then we also set those numeric jurisdictional targets that I mentioned, where each state has made specific goals about the number of school districts in their states that are well prepared. So, what does the data look like for this school district planning outcome right now? This is a cool chart because it shows all of the states here. And I will share that this one is different because the gray represents the number of, or the percent of school districts that did not report in the 2024 ELIT survey. And so, of course, to increase our understanding of environmental literacy implementation across the watershed, the more reporting local education agencies we have, the better. And so this is the kind of breakdown of the percent of school districts that are well prepared, represented by this teal, somewhat prepared with the lighter blue, and not prepared with the darker blue by state. And it's one thing about working across the watershed is that each state is so different. So, for example, here in Maryland, we only have 24 local education agencies, and in Pennsylvania, there are 499. So each state has made their own goal, and we're just hoping to achieve that by 2040. We can also look at this data across time. Now, this data does not include the percent of school districts that did not respond to the ELIT survey, but as a reminder, 44% of all school districts in the watershed reported, and that represents 74% of the student body across the watershed. And you can see some trends here where the percent of school districts that were well prepared was steadily increasing. But then we hit a hiccup with COVID. And so we're hoping to regrow this portion that is well prepared. And it's nice to
Olivia,
know, yes.
sorry, just wanted to make sure that we're on time. We're a little bit over here, so this is some great information, but if we could start to wrap things up so we can move on to Mark.
Don't you worry, this is my last slide.
Excellent,
Um,
thank you.
so it just shows that a majority of LEAs are somewhat prepared to implement high quality environmental education um, across the watershed. So that's good, but we're always hoping to grow that number. So if this stuff is interesting to you and thinking across the watershed about kind of our collective goals, please, I encourage you to provide public feedback on the draft revised watershed agreement before September 1st. And now I'll hand it off to Mark.
All right. Thank you, Olivia. It's so cool to see all the movement. It's like fantastic. Really happy to be with you all. I am just getting the right screen to share, and I am faced with the task of trying to boil down about 8 years worth of research into 12 minutes for y'all. So we've been trying to answer this very specific research question, like if you're able to get environmental education programs going, how do you ensure that they actually meet the outcomes you want them to meet? Like, how do you do it well, not just how do you do it? So what you're seeing here is a number of sponsors have supported our work over the years. I work with a colleague, a very close colleague at Clemson University named Bob Powell, and we have a huge research team that's continually growing with every new little piece that we do. Today, what I want to share with you is the answer to this big question, right? Like, what leads to better outcomes in environmental education? So I'm going to summarize, as best I can, two massive studies that have looked at this question across hundreds of environmental education field trips for middle school students across the United States. And when I say field trips, in this particular set of studies, we're looking at single-day field trips. So these aren't overnight experiences. We do other research on that, but the results I'm going to share is really relevant to those single-day field trips, which makes up like the majority of the types of field trips we see across the country. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, the first couple years of this study was figuring out what do we actually measure in terms of outcomes? Like what should students walk away from these programs? How should they be changed, right? So that was a very collaborative process. We did surveys all over the place. Some of you probably participated in that. And eventually we did get to a place where we could measure outcomes, and I'll share a little bit about that in a moment. Once we had those cross-cutting outcomes where we can say, all right, here's the things that every environmental education program across the United States should aspire to. Really hard question. We feel like we did get there. Then we could actually go out and do a comparative study where we can look across hundreds of programs measuring those same outcomes for every program. And if we're able to do that, and if we can get out there and observe these programs, we can actually align like what we observe with the programs that reach the highest outcomes for students. Okay, so that's like the basic design we're talking about. We did a lot of quantitative research. What I'm going to share with you today is kind of a mixed method little piece of this that we think best articulates really the key findings of what we've discovered over the last number of years doing this study. Okay, so when we talk about outcomes, we would go to these conferences and ask these questions like, all right, what should every environmental education program across the United States aspire to? And well, that's a tough question, right? I've got a program on butterflies. Well, I've got a program on climate change. How can you align them? Well, we looked into the literature and then we talked to tons of folks, and it came down to things that were related to environmental literacy, of course, but also positive youth development, 21st century skills, and meeting curriculum-based outcomes. We created something that we call EE21, which is short for Environmental Education Outcomes for the 21st Century. If you're interested in it, I think Abby can post a link right now in the chat that you can click on, and you can look at the very specific outcomes that we developed for the majority of our work in a quantitative study. The study I'm going to share with you today, the piece of it I'm going to share with you today, actually is a subset of like the massive, if you actually click on that and see this huge table, it's a subset of all these bullets that you see here. So when you see bullets like this, we measured all this stuff. Each one of these bullets has 3 or 4 survey items that we would measure with students immediately after they participate in a program to determine to what extent did the program impact these things for them. Okay, so the subset of those items that we're looking at in this particular piece that I'm about to share with you now is these. And what we know from having measured this over and over again and done tons of statistical analysis is these things actually co-vary. They're tightly related to all those outcomes you saw on the prior slide. Okay, so basically we're measuring environmental literacy, we're measuring impacts on like students' identity development, social emotional learning, and like just whether they're like having a good experience. Okay, so let me get into how we did this. The first thing we did was this, I think I mentioned this massive quantitative study where we had our students, we had our poor grad students, they suffered so badly. They traveled the country for months at a time and they attended over 400 single day programs, and they had these massive sheets. They observed these programs and they measured over 95 characteristics that they could observe about the program. And then they did surveys with the students immediately after. Okay, so rather than like have you look at this for too long, everything on that prior page can boil down to characteristics of the program design. Okay, so the programs could be primarily lecture, group project work, could be data collection, investigations, issue-focused stuff, games, play, group reflection versus individual reflection, all the pieces that you might see in like a Project Wet or Project Learning Tree or Project Wild book, like the way you design a program. We also looked at contextual factors like group size, weather, behavior. And then we also looked at instructor qualities, which is basically how is the program delivered and what are the demographics of the instructor? What of all this really makes a big difference? So I'm going to share one analysis that we feel contains the strongest evidence for what really works best for environmental education field trips. I'm going to just share gloss over the methods as much as I can, but I do want to share with you how we distinguish the programs that perform the best from the programs that didn't perform as well as others. So imagine that each one of these blue boxes you're looking at is a program. And then imagine, these are the programs we actually observed, each one of them has an outcome score, all right, based on all of the things that we are measuring in that student survey, okay? Then imagine that the ones I've just highlighted in green, these are the highest outcomes. They're the top quartile. So we take the top 25% of programs in terms of their outcomes, and we say, all right, those are in the group of programs that clearly are outperforming everybody else. And then these pink ones down at the bottom, these are the ones that are clearly lagging behind. They're not reaching the outcomes that the other groups are. And then we get rid of the ones in the middle. Okay, this is what we did for everything, but this is how we did this particular analysis I'm going to share. And the reason we did it this way is there's a lot of ambiguity in that middle. There's noise in the data. We want to do the most definitive thing we could possibly do and say, all right, what separates the absolute best performing programs from the programs that perform the least well performing, let's say. Okay, and so I'm going to jump straight into the results because I've got about 5 minutes to tell you about them. It all boiled down to six principles. I'm sorry. Every single program in the top quartile in the green had these six things going for it. Okay, all six of them actually, whereas in the bottom quartile is totally variable. Okay, so I'm going to lead you through what these things are. So if any of you are involved in designing programs, anything educational, these are things that can help make your programs better. And some of them aren't rocket science. This very first one is you got to meet students' basic needs. If they're freezing wearing t-shirts and it's 32 degrees outside and you're making them sit still in a place, no learning is going to happen. But we saw some really creative things going on in the programs that we actually observed, right? So sometimes there's a lot a program can do to prepare students prior to their visit, a lot of logistical things. Make sure you have all of this. Here's what it's going to be like. There's a lot of addressing fears on site, what do I do if we see a bear or a tick, right? To address that sort of fear. And some groups had gear libraries. So literally when a student group would show up, the very first thing they do is take turns, going to the bathroom, getting an orientation, and then gearing up, with hats or sweatshirts or hoodies or whatever they needed for the program. So there's lots of ways to deal with this. Not dealing with it is a program killer. Okay, number 2, managing students' attention. So this, again, it's not a surprise. But what we saw with this was some programs lacked variety, even if they were really good. So an example of this, one program did a kind of a nature walk in the morning, and they were using this great technique of observing and making hypotheses about everything they saw. And the kids loved it for an hour and a half. They had a quick lunch, and then after lunch, they did 2 hours of the same exact thing. And everyone checked out halfway through that. And by the end, the students were just done and ready to go home. Another piece of this has to do with a lot of environmental education activities. They're really exciting, and it might be a game, and lots of cool stuff is going on. But when you get out, what happens? Or if you're waiting around for the bus to come or the other group to show up at a trailhead, how do you engage the students? Well, there's a million ways you can do it, right? Have a scavenger hunt. Hey, go find the coolest rock. Bring it back to me and let's talk about it. Or find the neatest plant you can find out here and let's ask questions about it. So instructors who paid attention to filling that time with useful stuff, their programs did better. Instructional clarity. Okay, so this comes in a lot of different ways as well. Oftentimes there's data collection going on in these sites like dip netting or something like that. Actually taking the time to make sure students know what they're doing is pretty important, and we often assume that stuff is obvious. It's often not. So we found some really cool programs sometimes that would do this pre-trip preparation. If I'm your instructor, I come on and do a Zoom with your class, and I show you around the site and all the stuff you're going to use, and I send you some materials to practice such that when you get here, everything's going to work out well. Comes with the added benefit that by the time you arrive, I'm a rock star. You just saw me on TV, on a big screen. That works too. So practice using the tools and explaining the purpose of activities to kids, not just, okay, you're going to collect this data. But like set up, why are we collecting this data? What's it supposed to answer? Novelty. All right, so I've got this great picture of kids snorkeling in a river. It doesn't have to be that novel. You can make anything novel, right? So you can make a blade of grass novel. You can look at the blade of grass and get kids on their bellies and everyone take up a blade of grass and hold it to the light. And what do you see? Wow, light's coming through there. Did you know that grass is mostly hollow? Isn't that amazing? Right? There's a million ways we can do this. We can watch ants cross a sidewalk. Focusing on the novel piece is important. I can't tell you how many times we went and saw programs that felt like they were science class that just happened to take place somewhere else. Rather than like being in an amazing spot, like emphasize the beauty and excitement of being in that spot and what you can see there. I mean, even if you're in a parking lot, it's more interesting than a classroom. I have lots of stories to tell about this, but I only have, I think, like 2 minutes to go. Okay, emotional support. So this seems sort of obvious too. We had our students tracking the behaviors of instructors, and the instructors ranged from like walking encyclopedias who would tell you every fact about everything they saw to authoritarian, you know, um, disciplinarians to like friends or coaches or almost like parents who are giving high fives and being really responsive and trying to make friends with kids. And what we saw is that soft touch with positive affect, right? Like high fives. Hey, you're doing awesome. Answering questions, being kind about it. And if you don't know the answer to the question, that's fine. Just being like, hey, I don't know. Let's go find out the answer when we get back to the nature center or whatever it might be. Asking kids, hey, what are you most interested here when they arrive? I think we can look at that, making kids feel like they have some level of control over the experience. One of the things we noticed is when we talk to folks about this, we assume that we're all capable of this, but without paying close attention to it, we often don't do it, right? So we need to start building this stuff into our training if we really want to do a good job and hit the outcomes we care about. Okay, number 6, and this is probably the most important one. It came out the strongest signal in our data. And that's providing a cohesive or thematic experience. So a thematic experience is basically this idea of what holds everything together. So a lot of these programs do like stations, like, oh, we're going to do water quality testing here. We're going to do soils here, and then we're going to do a high ropes adventure over here. Okay, like, great. So if the students come home and the parents ask them like, hey, what'd you do? Students could tell them like, oh, we did water, soils, and high ropes. But if the parents ask, what was the point? I don't know if a student can answer that. So we need to think about what was the point? Can students actually answer the question, why did they do all that stuff? So imagine a theme that connect those things. Maybe it could be, let's think about communities and how different components of communities, whether they're social or ecological, work together. Right? That might be the theme of your program. The theme of your program can be just about anything, but it should be apparent to students when they leave, rather than disparate pieces of even interesting or fun activities. If they don't connect, students don't walk away with a whole lot. Okay, so here's the 6 key principles. I think I did it in 12 minutes, like 12.5, sorry. I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff. And here's the core research team. And I'll stop talking now so that we can have a conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark and Olivia. Those were great presentations, and I'm sure there's room for many questions and many chat. Please feel free. We also have questions that were submitted in advance I can jump into. But let's give folks 1 second to put a question or two in the chat. Um, so I'll go ahead and hop in with a question. So we just heard about some of those best practices from Mark, and one of the questions was, where do you see leverage points in educational systems that already exist to support these sustainable systemic environmental literacy programs? Like,
Mm.
how can they be incorporated into pre-existing systems?
It's a really good question, and I can think of just 2 quick things off the top of my head. We've done studies about what motivates teachers to get engaged in these types of programs and like bring their students to national parks and stuff like that. And what we find is the assumption is often that there aren't resources to do it. what we find is if teachers are motivated and they go to their principals and say, we want to do it, there's almost always a way to do it. Um, I don't know, that may be changing now in the new political landscape, but what we found is like teachers are actually the key in having a champion within a school.
Mm.
And if they're having a great experience, it starts to spread and other teachers want to do it too, right? And if the kids are having a great experience, their parents find out about it, it can become an institution in a school. Um, the other thing I would say is teaching almost any subject can be enhanced by doing it through experiential environmental education. Like it's more fun. It's like students remember it a lot more. So it's not just about like making these students environmental stewards and conservation advocates, but it's actually just better education. So I think sometimes we need to pitch it that way, as opposed to, oh, we're going to get your students connected to nature. It's like not every audience, not every superintendent cares about that, but they do care about educating their students. So this is a technique, is actually a really powerful communication tool rather than saying like anything that, this group might really care about, which maybe like environmental stewardship or something like that.
Mm. And I'll just add to that, if those champion teachers or champion folks within a certain school district can make the argument for how environmental literacy advances some kind of state level priority, that can sort of like open the door for environmental education. So, for example, in Maryland, right now, we're implementing the blueprint for Maryland's future, and there are a bunch of pillars that talk about how Maryland's education system is going to, change in the near future. And one of them, for example, is high quality and diverse teachers and learners. And so that is a state priority, and somebody could make the argument that professional development for teachers, getting them more comfortable with taking their students outside and engaged in this in environmental education is a way to achieve that pillar. So whether it's a priority at the state level or the county level, I think the question is very astute for realizing that you have to, um, you know, make the argument that environmental education promotes those existing uh, priorities.
Hmm. Yes. Okay, thank you. A question in the chat we had that Mark answered in the chat, and I think you both just answered briefly in your questions, but if you have anything additional to add about what you believe the point of environmental literacy is for you, because you both just mentioned it's not always about environmental learning. Sometimes it's about social, emotional growth and student experiences.
Yeah, I put a very personal response there, just what I think, but I think it can meet, I mean, we've seen it in the literature and we've seen it in our own research. It can meet so many different types of outcomes that it kind of depends on your circumstance and what your students or what your schools or whoever your audience is really needs, right?
Agreed. Olivia.
I'm just going to second Mark's definition. And that add for me personally, graduating literate students is important because that means that they're going to be environmentally literate constituents and consumers and, members of the community. So that's the big why for me personally.
Mhm. Thank you. Meredith Dash asked, what work is being done to share Mark's work at the pre-service level so that our future teachers are well prepared?
I think that's like really variable. Most of the work that I do in terms of like disseminating this stuff, we run a number of learning networks with the providers themselves. So like a lot of the reach that I have is with like the program providers rather than the school teachers. I'd love to hear ideas about how to inject our findings into pre-service teachers though. If anybody has any, let me know.
I'll just quickly share that in Maryland, there's an effort called the Higher Education Environmental Literacy Network. It was started originally under a kind of statewide initiative called Project Green Classrooms. It's now called the Maryland Outdoor Learning Partnership, which is co-chaired by Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the Maryland State Department of Education. But the folks who participate in that group are professors at Towson University, for example, Maryland Sea Grant, that are working with pre-service teachers, and specifically they're working with faculty of within their like Institute of Higher Education to say, hey, where in your curriculum could you increase, you know, their familiarity with the environmental literacy standards that we have here in Maryland. And that has definitely been a network approach. Um, for us here in Maryland. And so right now it's about faculty talking to other faculty, but I know that there's a lot of interest in sort of scaling that effort up. And we recently had an awesome letter from the chancellor of Maryland's Institutes of Higher Education, kind of calling for the importance of environmental literacy in, and so there's this great window of opportunity happening in Maryland right now to increase that pre-service teacher preparedness.
I think there's a great point in the comments here that yeah, I mean we lack outreach, right? I think we have messages that are pretty good, and there's a lot of data supporting it about like, hey, this is good for your kids. It's also good for your teachers. Like, as we do surveys with teachers after these programs, and we almost never publish on it because it's so positively skewed. There's no variability. It's like teachers are so psyched to come and do these types of things when they can. Um, and it can benefit their classroom climate when they go back. I mean, there's all these secondary benefits of these programs. So I think it really is about thinking about the right media, the like means for reaching these audiences, and then matching the right type of messaging with that audience. Like, how do you just enhance the educational experience for your kids and for yourself? Rather than our typical stuff that we like to say about, environmental stewardship, connection with nature, which we love too, but not everybody, needs to hear that.
Right. So kind of similar to that, we have a question about what you think is being done to make a bridge between the classroom and non-formal educators. So maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but based on the previous question, I'm thinking a little bit about who does the burden fall on to do that outreach and make those connections? Is it solely on the teachers to engage with non-formal educators in field trip locations and sites, or vice versa?
I think it varies so much by context. So I've been doing a lot of work out in Oregon and Washington because they have these outdoor schools for all programs going, which have both been defunded recently. But up until recently, there was funding to get every middle school kid out into one of these experiences. And even in those cases, it's been variable. So sometimes it's driven by the non-formal educators and their institutions going into schools and selling their programs. And other times it really does come from just a champion teacher who feels it's important and it goes the other direction. Um, I think school administrators play a huge role, but they're not the ones like leading the trips, right? So it can't be them alone to make it really work well.
Yes. Um, Go
I
ahead,
was
Olivia.
Thank you. I was just going to quickly add that in recent years, the Chesapeake Bay Trust has funded this outdoor learning network initiative, which really encourages environmental literacy providers to sit down with the school districts that they want to serve and make sure that their programs are achieving the formal education priorities of that school district. It often also involves, multiple education providers working together. And I'm going to send a little link about that effort. But that has been really encouraging because it's a two-way kind of dialogue between the school district and the provider to make sure that it's serving both effectively.
Awesome. Thank you. I was about to ask if there were modules or programs or funding specific to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So that answered that. And if you have any others to add in, that would be a great time. So while Olivia shares that in the chat, we had a question of about whether there's been any new research documenting the effect of outdoor and environmental education directly on student achievement and well-being.
Short answer is yes. Longer answer is you might be disappointed in like what you find. There is evidence. The challenge is if you want to get into like students' grades and academic performance, that's where it gets really tricky because there's so many confounding factors and you can't really do randomized controlled experiments on this sort of stuff. But in the PDF that Abby will send out after this meeting, there are some links there that you can follow and you should be able to find some evidence you can hang your hat on with regard, especially with regard to student well-being. That's a bit easier than like the academic achievement piece.
Gabriella, I'm going to answer one of the questions that I saw somebody submit before this webinar, which was just how is environmental education sort of being received right now? Does it feel popular or not popular? And I'm happy to say that I've heard anecdotally from the folks who are collecting feedback on the draft revised version of the watershed agreement that there's a lot of positive support for the environmental literacy outcomes. So that's um, very good news.
Yeah, that is great news. Thank you for sharing. Um, Let me just get myself situated here.
So I look at
Mm,
Meredith put an
that was a great.
interesting question in there. There is some research on that. If you look at the work of Louise Chawla, she was at Colorado. She's since retired, but it's Chawla. She's done a lot of life experience research where they interview folks who are like in the green workforce later in their careers. So it's these kind of ethnographic interviews, and it's uncanny how many point to nature experiences and formal environmental education experiences as kids that lead them there. So there is some evidence you can look for there. I'll write her name here, and you can look her up as an author. Um,
That's excellent. Um, I also may butcher this, so if anyone else in the Zoom has any information on this, feel free to hop in. But I know that there's been chatter in Maryland specifically to create a sort of training pathway for high school students that are environmentally focused, as opposed like in addition to those that are like trade focused, like HVAC, mechanic, things like that, but that are green jobs focused. And I know that we got a question beforehand about requirements for should environmental literacy be a qualification for high school graduation. And that is a specific way in a local jurisdiction within the Chesapeake Bay region that we're working on, um, not making a requirement per se, but making a pathway for students to enter the green workforce via these experiences through training programs. The CTE pathways, as Jemima shared in the chat.
Yeah, that's a huge opportunity that we're seeing that's kind of been bubbling up across the watershed for the last few years of like how to connect environmental education with job opportunities and the growing green workforce that's going to be our future. And so I think that making wherever possible, if you can connect environmental education and climate education to career and tech ed in your school district or in your state, that's an area where there seems to be a lot of opportunity. And specifically in Maryland, I mentioned the blueprint for Maryland's future, and one of our pillars is about expanding those career and tech opportunities, apprenticeships, internships. And so I think as a community, we're interested in making sure that as many of those as possible are related to green careers.
Great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions I may have missed in the chat before we wrap up? Trying my best to keep up with everything as it comes through.
there was a question about survey templates for standardized environmental literacy tests. There's a lot
Yes.
out there. Challenge is I mean, my screen just went blank. There's a there's a challenge in assessing it, right? So there is like a long form national environmental literacy test that was developed years ago that's kind of more like a school exam. We tend to do very different types of surveys. So if you click on that the EE21 uh, link that Abby put up earlier, you'll see another example. It really depends on what your outcomes are, and you really need to tailor your surveys to that. And then to actually link it to the programs, if you care about that, you probably need an evaluation consultant who can just help. We've been trying to do participatory evaluations for decades with really smart people, and yeah, people are just too busy in this field to take that on as well, right? So there is like a whole cadre of professionals out there who do this type of work, and I'd recommend like reaching out. I can probably link you to people too if it's something that you're interested in to try and actually get good data on the outcomes of any of the programming that you do.
Great, thank you. We've gotten recommendations to check out Bay Backpack for a lot of these resources a couple of times in the chat. Olivia just shared it again, and so a lot of that will be useful for answering the questions asked here and beforehand as well. Um, do you either of you have any final words, recommendations, takeaways for environmental literacy and education efforts? How get students and teachers engaged?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll just say two things. One is just like know your audience when you want to get folks engaged. Like if you care about these sets of things, first consider what they care about prior to trying to convince somebody that they should do something like this. And I guess the big findings that we've had in our work over the years and years of doing this is you can like almost any pedagogical approach can work, ranging from like inquiry based to project based to play based, like all this stuff. It's more in how you do it if you want to have a positive impact on the students, not just like, oh yeah, we followed the directions and we did it. That's what our research is showing. Hopefully that came out pretty clearly. But like you gotta like have the passion and like really think through how to meet those students where they are.
Thank you,
I'll second
Olivia.
Mark's answer and just add that in terms of knowing your audience, getting kids outside and off of their phones is pretty universally popular. So when in doubt, start there. But yes, definitely um, tying to the priorities of who you're speaking to is important. And hang in there. I've noticed a lot of friendly fa names in the participants list, and we're such a great community. So whether you're doing this work locally or if you're connected to the state or regional work, hang in there, keep chugging.
All right. Well, thank you both to our speakers and attendees. This was a great discussion and some really interesting research. Our next roundtable webinar will be September 17th. And so please join us for our next fruitful discussion topic to be announced. Thank you. Have a great day.
Adios.